May of 633 AD opened with fire on the plains of Mesopotamia. Dust hung in the air, rivers ran dark with blood, and something unimaginable had just happened. In a matter of weeks, two imperial armies of the Sassanid Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, had been wiped from the field. These were not border skirmishes or unlucky defeats. They were total collapses. Chains meant to hold enemies in place lay abandoned in the sand. Elite infantry, trained and equipped by an empire that had dominated the region for centuries, were gone. In the royal court at Ctesiphon, shock turned into fear. What began as a distant disturbance now threatened the very heart of the empire. The Persian leadership faced a truth they were not prepared to accept. Their frontier was broken, their prestige shattered, and their assumptions about power no longer held. This was no longer about territory. It was about survival. What made the crisis unbearable was the source of it. The threat did not come from Rome, nor from another great civilization. It came from the desert, from a commander many had dismissed. Khalid ibn al-Walid, leading a smaller, leaner force, had exposed a weakness no one believed existed. And as the empire scrambled to respond, history stood on the edge of a turning point. One shaped not by size or wealth, but by timing, insight, and an audacity that would echo for centuries. For the Sassanid Empire, humiliation was never a condition to be tolerated for long. What had unfolded along the frontier was not merely a military embarrassment. It was a direct challenge to the idea of imperial permanence itself. Empires survive on perception as much as power, and the perception that the Sassanids could be beaten, by an army from the desert, was poison. In Ctesiphon, the response was swift and absolute. This would not be handled by half measures or local commanders. The empire would answer in full. Orders went out across Mesopotamia and Persia for total mobilization. Garrisons were stripped, reserves called up, supply depots unlocked. The machinery of a superpower began to move, slow but immense. The Sassanid state had fought Rome to a standstill for generations. It knew how to wage large, organized war. Heavy infantry, armored cavalry, engineers, and logistical trains were assembled with a single purpose: to end Khalid ibn al-Walid before his victories could become legend. This was not an army sent to contain a threat. It was an army sent to erase one. The strategy chosen reflected imperial confidence. Rather than seeking a single decisive engagement, the Sassanid high command designed a trap that relied on their greatest advantage: scale. Two armies would move independently, converging on the same battlefield. The first would draw Khalid in and hold him in place. The second would arrive like a closing door, sealing escape and turning resistance into annihilation. It was the classic hammer and anvil refined by centuries of warfare. Against such pressure, no smaller force could survive. At least that was the assumption. One army marched under Andazagar, a seasoned frontier governor who understood Arab mobility and desert warfare. He was not a court favorite elevated by politics, but a professional soldier hardened by years of conflict along the borderlands. His task was patience. He would choose ground that favored heavy infantry, dig in, and deny Khalid the freedom of movement that had carried him so far. Andazagar knew that speed was Khalid's strength, and he intended to smother it beneath discipline and mass. The second army was something else entirely. It was commanded by Bahman, one of the most respected generals of the Sassanid world, and it carried the empire's strategic reserves. These were the formations that did not march unless the situation was dire. Veterans, heavily armored, supported by the full logistical might of the state. When Bahman moved, he moved to finish wars, not prolong them. His role was decisive. Arrive at the right moment, strike from the rear, and turn containment into destruction. Together, the plan was elegant and merciless. Khalid would face a force too large to ignore and too strong to break quickly. As the battle settled into stalemate, the Second Army would descend, cutting off retreat and pressing the Muslim force against the rivers and ridges of Mesopotamia. There would be nowhere to run. No room to maneuver. Victory would come not through brilliance but inevitability. From the Persian perspective, this was how empires won wars. Numbers, coordination, and overwhelming pressure. Individual commanders did not defeat empires. Systems did. And in that system, Khalid ibn al-Walid was merely a variable to be eliminated. Yet beneath the confidence lay urgency. The empire was acting not from comfort but from fear. Every day Khalid remained undefeated was another crack in the image of invincibility. The mobilization itself was an admission that something had gone terribly wrong. The Sassanids were bringing the full weight of their power to bear because they could no longer afford uncertainty. As the two armies marched toward their convergence point, The stage was set for what the Persians believed would be a final reckoning. To them, this was the moment when order would reassert itself, when the desert upstart would be crushed between forces he could neither outrun nor outfight. The trap was carefully laid, the commanders confident, the outcome seemingly assured. But history has a habit of punishing certainty. And as the empire prepared to strike back with everything it had, it failed to ask the most dangerous question of all. What if the man they were trying to destroy could see the trap before it closed? While the Sassanid Empire set its trap with confidence born of centuries of dominance, Khalid ibn al-Walid was already listening. He did not command from marble halls or rely on slow-moving couriers. His advantage lay in something far less visible and far more effective: information. Across the deserts and river valleys of Mesopotamia moved a quiet network of scouts, messengers, and sympathetic tribesmen known simply as the Eyes of the Desert. They watched roads, counted banners, measured dust clouds on the horizon, and carried their knowledge not on paper but in memory. Through them, Khalid learned what the empire believed it could conceal: that two armies were moving, not one, and that their purpose was not battle but annihilation. The moment the picture became clear, Khalid understood the danger with brutal clarity. If the two Persian forces were allowed to unite, the campaign would end there. No maneuver, no courage, no speed could compensate for that kind of mass. This was not a situation that allowed hesitation or debate. Time itself had become the enemy. Every hour that passed brought the imperial jaws closer together. Khalid did not speak of retreat, but he knew. Standing still meant death. The only path forward was movement, fast, decisive, and calculated. What followed was a race not just across open land, but against expectation. Khalid pushed his men hard, asking them to endure heat, fatigue, and uncertainty in order to arrive before the trap could fully close. This was leadership of a particular kind, the kind that does not promise safety, only purpose. His soldiers were not marching toward comfort or reinforcement. They were marching toward risk, guided by the belief that delay was more dangerous than action. As the Muslim force advanced, Khalid began to look beyond the enemy and study the land itself. Battles, he understood, are rarely decided by courage alone. They are shaped by terrain, by lines of sight, by what a commander chooses to see as limitation or opportunity. When he approached the plains near Walajah, he recognized immediately why the Persians had chosen this ground. The wide, open field favored heavy infantry. The ridges behind the Persian lines offered protection, anchoring their rear and eliminating the fear of surprise. To a conventional commander, it was ideal defensive terrain. But Khalid did not see the battlefield as the Persians did. Where they saw safety, he saw structure. Where they saw a wall, he saw a door that could be opened from the other side. The ridges that gave the Persian army confidence also fixed them in place, narrowing their awareness and encouraging a dangerous sense of control. Khalid understood that overconfidence is not arrogance, it is comfort. And comfort dulls attention. The numbers only reinforced that mindset. The Persian force waiting at Walajah was massive, perhaps twice or even 3 times the size of Khalid's army. Its commander, Andazagar, had every reason to feel secure. He had chosen the ground, he had the manpower, and he knew a second army was marching to support him. From his perspective, Khalid was already contained. All that remained was patience. Khalid allowed that perception to take root. He did not rush to disrupt the Persian deployment. He did not signal panic or desperation. Instead, he presented exactly what his enemy expected to see: a smaller force approaching a stronger one, forced into confrontation by circumstance rather than choice. The battlefield itself became part of the deception. This was not recklessness. It was calculation layered upon calculation. Khalid understood that Andazagar's confidence was the true center of gravity. The Persian general believed the fight would unfold in predictable stages: engagement, pressure, exhaustion, collapse. He believed Khalid would be trapped by numbers and ground. And because he believed this, he would commit fully when the moment appeared right. That belief was the opening Khalid needed. As the armies settled into position, the shape of the coming battle was already taking form in Khalid's mind. He had measured the distance between ridges, the slope of the land, the time it would take cavalry to move unseen. He had weighed the patience of his enemy against the urgency of the approaching second army. Everything depended on precision. Too early and the Persians would adapt. Too late and Bahman's forces would arrive to finish the work. The trap had been revealed, but only to one man. What Andazagar saw was an enemy walking into a web. What Khalid saw was an opponent preparing himself to be surrounded. And in that difference between perception and reality, the fate of the Battle of Walajah was already being decided, long before the first swords would meet. Night fell quietly over the plains near Walajah, but there was nothing quiet about what Khalid ibn al-Walid was preparing. While the Persian camp settled into routine, confident in numbers and terrain, Khalid moved with intention. He understood that the battle would not be decided by strength at first light, but by what happened before dawn, when assumptions went unchallenged and vigilance faded. This was the moment when disciplined systems were most vulnerable, not to force but to imagination. Under cover of darkness, Khalid selected 2 of his most trusted cavalry commanders and assigned them nearly half of his mounted force. These were not inexperienced riders or reckless volunteers. They were men who understood silence, timing, and restraint. Their orders were simple in wording and terrifying in implication: ride wide, stay unseen, and disappear from the battlefield entirely. They were to move through gullies and broken ground, circling far beyond the Persian line of sight, and take position behind the ridges that protected the enemy's rear. Once there, they were to wait. Not minutes, not hours. They were to wait until the moment when the enemy believed the battle was already won. By sunrise, the cavalry had vanished. To Persian observers scanning the field, Khalid's army appeared smaller than expected, thin at the center, light on the flanks. This only confirmed what Andazagar already believed. He had the numbers, he had the ground, he had reinforcements on the way. The Arabs, in his mind, were trapped by circumstance and pride. When the battle began, it unfolded exactly as the Persians anticipated. Heavy infantry advanced in disciplined ranks, shields locked, pushing forward with the slow confidence of a force accustomed to dominance. The clash was brutal and exhausting. Khalid's infantry met the advance, trading ground for time, absorbing pressure without breaking. To the Persian command, it looked like progress. Step by step, the enemy was being driven back. Then Khalid gave the order that confirmed Andazagar's certainty. The Muslim center began to retreat. It was not a rout, but it looked like one. The line bent inward, forming a shallow crescent as men gave ground in controlled stages. Dust rose. Gaps appeared. From a distance, it looked like collapse. For Andazagar, this was the moment the battle turned from expectation into opportunity. Victory was no longer a matter of patience. It was something to be seized. He ordered his wings to press inward. More men were fed into the center. The Persian formation compressed, tightening as thousands of soldiers pushed forward into the concave space Khalid had deliberately created. Discipline gave way to momentum. Momentum gave way to urgency. In their focus on the retreating enemy, the Persians stopped thinking about the ridges behind them. This was the commitment Khalid had been waiting for. As the Persian army poured deeper into the pocket, its shape changed. What had been a broad, flexible line became a dense mass. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver, unable to see beyond the men in front of them. Their strength, numbers, had become a liability. And in that moment, with the enemy fully invested and the field irrevocably shaped, Khalid raised his sword. The signal was given. From behind the ridges came a sound no Persian officer had planned for. Not the clash of steel, but thunder, thousands of hooves pounding earth at full speed. The hidden cavalry crested the hills and charged downhill in tight formation, sunlight flashing off armor and spear points. There was no warning, no time to react. The Persian rear ranks turned just in time to see death rushing toward them. Panic spread instantly. Soldiers who had believed their backs were protected now faced an enemy they could neither escape nor confront effectively. The cavalry struck with devastating force, tearing into the rear while Khalid's center halted its retreat and surged forward. What had appeared to be a broken line suddenly became a wall. The encirclement closed. From every direction came pressure. Infantry from the front, cavalry from the rear, light horse sealing the flanks. Inside the circle, cohesion collapsed. Commands were lost in the noise. Men could not raise their weapons without striking their own. Fear replaced discipline, and discipline had been the foundation of imperial power. This was not simply a victory of movement, but of understanding. Khalid had not defeated the Persians by matching their strength. He had defeated them by shaping their decisions. Every step they took, every order they followed, had carried them deeper into the trap they believed they were springing. By the time the Persians realized what was happening, there was nothing left to do but survive. And for most of them, survival was no longer possible. The impossible maneuver was complete, not because it relied on chance but because it relied on patience, timing, and a willingness to trust a plan that would look like madness until the final moment. Long before the last sword fell, the outcome had already been decided in the darkness of the night ride. What followed at Walajah was not simply defeat. It was the unmaking of an imperial army, beginning not with broken bodies, but with broken certainty. The moment the encirclement closed, the Sassanid force ceased to function as a system. For centuries, Persian armies had relied on discipline, hierarchy, and coordination to turn numbers into power. At Walajah, those same strengths collapsed inward, transformed into liabilities by the very density that once inspired confidence. The double envelopment was complete. From the front, Khalid's infantry pressed forward with renewed force, no longer yielding ground but reclaiming it step by step. From the rear, cavalry thundered into formations that had never been meant to fight in reverse. On the flanks, light horsemen sealed every opening, turning a battlefield into a prison. The Persians were surrounded not by chaos but by precision. There was no single point of failure to escape through, no weak edge to exploit. The trap was symmetrical, deliberate, and final. Inside the encirclement, panic spread faster than orders ever could. Soldiers who had marched into battle believing themselves protected suddenly understood they were cut off from everything familiar: commanders, supply lines, and retreat. Men in the center were crushed by their own ranks, packed so tightly they could barely raise their arms. Those in the rear turned to face the cavalry charge only to find themselves pressed forward by comrades who had no idea what was happening behind them. Fear moved through the mass like a shockwave, and with it went cohesion. Discipline did not vanish instantly. At first, officers shouted for order. Standards were raised. Commands were issued to hold, to push through, to break the enemy line. But discipline requires space to function, and space no longer existed. The Persian army had been designed to advance, not to pivot under pressure from all sides. Its structure assumed a front and a rear, safety and danger, progress and retreat. Khalid had erased those distinctions. As confusion deepened, discipline gave way to instinct. Units fought independently, then not at all. Some soldiers attempted to force their way out, only to collide with their own formations or the blades of the encircling cavalry. Others froze, overwhelmed by noise, heat, and the realization that the assumptions they had carried into battle were wrong. This was the true collapse, not of bodies but of belief. The killing that followed was relentless. Sources describe the battle giving way to what can only be called a massacre. Encirclement is unforgiving by nature, and at Walajah it was executed with devastating efficiency. The fighting lasted for hours, stretching into the afternoon as resistance steadily eroded. Few Persians escaped the ring. Those who did were scattered, wounded, and leaderless, fleeing not as soldiers but as survivors. The land itself seemed to absorb the violence. The wide plain that had promised security became a place of entrapment. The ridges that once protected the Persian rear now stood silent witnesses to the cost of overconfidence. By sunset, the field belonged entirely to Khalid ibn al-Walid. He had destroyed a third imperial army in as many engagements, not through attrition, but through understanding. For Andazagar, the commander who had entered the battle so certain of control, the end was cruelly fitting. He did not fall amid his troops. He escaped the encirclement with a small bodyguard and fled into the desert, hoping to reach safety through speed and endurance. But the desert is unforgiving to those who do not respect it. Lost, exhausted, and alone, Andazagar died of thirst, claimed by the very environment he believed he had mastered. His army lay dead behind him, a testament to a plan that had failed not because it was poorly conceived, but because it faced an opponent who saw beyond it. The collapse of the Sassanid force at Walajah sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. This was not just another loss. It was a psychological rupture. Empires can survive defeat, but they struggle to survive humiliation, especially when that humiliation is delivered with clarity and intent. Khalid had not merely beaten the Persians. He had exposed a truth they could no longer ignore. Their power was conditional, their systems fallible, their certainty misplaced. For the men who stood victorious at the end of the day, the spoils were immense. Gold, armor, supplies. Wealth that symbolized imperial reach now lay in the hands of soldiers far from home. Yet even in victory there was no illusion of finality. Khalid understood that this collapse, as total as it was, had not ended the war. Another army still moved nearby. Another confrontation loomed. But Walajah would not be forgotten. It became a moment studied, remembered, and quietly feared. A reminder that arrogance invites blindness, and that the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the largest army, but the one who understands how confidence itself can be turned into a weapon. As the dust finally settled over the plains of Walajah, what remained was more than the wreckage of an imperial army. What stood revealed was a tactical achievement that would echo across centuries. Khalid ibn al-Walid had executed a maneuver so precise, so disciplined, that it would later be studied alongside the greatest battlefield reversals in history. This was not victory by chance or desperation. It was victory by design, shaped long before the first blade was drawn. The spoils of Walajah were staggering. Armor forged for emperors, gold meant to fund an empire, supplies gathered to sustain armies, wealth beyond anything most of Khalid's men had ever seen. Yet the mood was not triumphal. Khalid understood something many commanders learned too late: success invites consequence. The greater the victory, the sharper the response it provokes. Empires do not forgive humiliation. They retaliate. And retaliation was already on the march. Even as Walajah fell silent, another Persian army was gathering, larger and angrier than the last. The defeat had not broken the Sassanid will, it had hardened it. The coming confrontation would not be about pride or territory. It would be about survival. The next battlefield would be soaked not just in blood, but in desperation. Walajah then was not an ending. It was a turning point. It reminds us that brilliance can change outcomes, but it cannot erase consequences. For leaders, builders, and decision-makers of any era, the lesson is timeless. Strategy may win the day, but legacy is forged in what follows. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced a moment where timing mattered more than force, where insight mattered more than resources, then you already understand why history remembers Walajah. And this journey is not over. In our next episode, we follow Khalid toward the next confrontation, where the cost of victory will be higher and the margin for error even thinner. Subscribe to the channel, stay with us, and continue exploring the moments where history turns on a single decision.